Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Beerus warned Goku to never use this power? Subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And also check the description. So let's begin the story. The silence on King Kai's planet had always been a peculiar thing. Not quite peaceful, not quite oppressive, but something caught perpetually between the two. It was the kind of silence that made every movement feel deliberate. Every breath a conscious choice rather than an automatic function. Goku had trained here enough times that he should have grown accustomed to it. But tonight the quiet pressed against him with unusual weight, as though the small world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something he couldn't name. His body moved through the kata with mechanical precision, each strike cutting through air that felt somehow thicker than usual. The movements were perfect. Years of muscle memory refined to the point where thought became unnecessary. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong about the exercise. It was like speaking words in a language he'd once been fluent in, only to discover that somewhere along the way, the meaning had drained from every syllable. He'd been restless since the Tournament of Power ended, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. They'd won. Universe 7 had survived. He should have felt triumphant, satisfied, ready to push forward to the next challenge. Instead, there was this absence. A hollow sensation that lived somewhere between his chest and stomach, gnawing at him during quiet moments when there was nothing to fight, nothing to strive against. The kata ended with a strike that should have felt definitive but instead hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. Goku lowered his fist slowly, staring at his hand as though it belonged to someone else. His knuckles were calloused from decades of training, scars layering over scars until the original skin was just a memory. These hands had shattered mountains, caught energy blasts that could vaporize planets, touched power that gods themselves struggled to comprehend. And yet they felt empty tonight. He flexed his fingers, watching tendons shift beneath skin, and tried to identify what was missing. Not strength. He could feel that coiled in his muscles, ready to be called upon. Not technique. His body knew 10,000 ways to fight, each one refined through countless hours of practice. Something else. Something deeper. Like a note just beyond the range of hearing that he knew should be there but couldn't quite grasp. The small moon above King Kai's planet cast strange shadows across the curved surface, making the training ground feel almost alien despite its familiarity. Goku had always found comfort in the routine of training, the simple clarity of improvement, the honest feedback of a body pushed to its limits. But lately, even that certainty had begun to feel questionable. As though he'd been climbing a mountain his entire life only to discover the summit kept receding with each step forward. He was considering running through the kata again, searching for whatever flaw or imperfection his instincts kept insisting was there, when he felt it. A presence approaching that made his entire body tense with an awareness that bypassed conscious thought. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier in a way that had nothing to do with physical pressure. Goku turned slowly, his combat instincts cataloging details before his mind fully processed them. The particular quality of the approaching ki, the deliberate pace of movement, the complete absence of any attempt at concealment. This wasn't an attack or even a challenge. This was an announcement. Beerus materialized with the casual authority of someone who existed beyond the normal rules of presence and absence. The god of destruction's appearance should have been familiar by now. They'd fought, trained, even shared meals together, but something about tonight felt fundamentally different. The usual casual arrogance that characterized Beerus's demeanor was absent, replaced by something Goku had never seen in him before. It took him a moment to identify it: gravity. Not the physical force that made King Kai's small planet a challenge for most beings, but the emotional weight of someone carrying a burden they'd long tried to set down but found impossible to release. Beerus? Goku's voice came out more uncertain than he'd intended, the single word somehow encompassing all the questions he couldn't quite form. Where's Whis? Why are you here? What's happened? The god didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to the edge of the small planet, staring out at the void beyond with an expression that might have been contemplation or might have been the careful mask someone wore when trying not to reveal how much they were actually feeling. The starlight caught on his features in ways that made him look ancient, not old, but timeless, as though he'd witnessed the birth and death of countless civilizations and found each one both precious and ultimately insignificant. We need to talk, Beerus said finally, and the words landed with the weight of something irrevocable, A door closing that couldn't be opened again. About something I should have discussed with you long ago. Something I've been avoiding. That last word carried an admission that sent warning signals through Goku's entire nervous system. Gods didn't avoid things. They confronted, destroyed, passed judgment, moved on. Avoidance implied fear, and the idea of Beerus, the destroyer himself, being afraid of something was more terrifying than any enemy Goku had ever faced. Sure, Goku said, keeping his voice carefully neutral even as his mind raced through possibilities. Want some food first? I've got some of that instant ramen Bulma gave me, Goku. The interruption was sharp, cutting through his attempt at normalcy with the precision of a blade. This isn't a social visit. This is what I should have done the moment I realized what you were becoming. The silence that followed felt like it had texture, like something physical that Goku could reach out and touch if he tried. He'd learned over the years to read the spaces between words, the things people didn't say often revealing more than what they did. And right now, those spaces were screaming with implications he didn't want to examine too closely. Okay, he said slowly, lowering himself to sit cross-legged on the grass that shouldn't exist on this impossible planetoid. It was a gesture of openness, of willingness to listen, though every instinct he possessed was telling him he didn't want to hear what came next. I'm listening. Beerus remained standing for a long moment, his silhouette stark against the alien stars, before finally settling down across from Goku with a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of centuries, millennia, perhaps, of memory. How much do you know about the history of Universe 7? He asked, and the question felt like the opening move in a game Goku didn't know the rules to. Not the recent history, not the battles you've fought or the tournaments you've won. I mean the deep history. The ages before your planet had a name, before your species existed. Goku considered the question seriously, trying to sort through everything he'd learned from King Kai, the Supreme Kai, even Whis. Not much, he admitted finally. Bits and pieces. Most of it doesn't seem relevant to. That's where you're wrong. Beerus's interruption was softer this time, almost gentle. The past is always relevant, especially when it has a habit of repeating itself. And I'm watching it happen again, right in front of me, and I can't. I won't let it end the same way twice. The god's hands were clenched in his lap, Goku noticed, not with anger but with something closer to desperation. It was such a profoundly ungodlike gesture that it made everything else fall into sharper focus. This wasn't a lecture or a warning delivered from on high. This was someone trying to prevent a tragedy they'd witnessed before. Millions of years ago, Beerus began, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting a story they told themselves countless times, trying to find different meanings in the same words. There was a mortal in Universe 7. A warrior like you. Perhaps not as naturally talented, but driven by the same hunger for improvement, the same need to push beyond every limit and discover what lay on the other side. Goku felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard stories like this before. Cautionary tales about warriors who flew too close to the sun, pushed too hard, became something they shouldn't have been. But the look in Beerus's eyes suggested this wasn't mythology or metaphor. This was memory, specific and painful. His name is lost now, Beerus continued, staring at something only he could see. Even I've forgotten it, though I try sometimes to remember. But I remember everything else about him. The way he fought with this joy, this pure enthusiasm for the challenge. The way he'd laugh after every battle, already thinking about the next one. The way he refused to accept that there were heights he couldn't reach. The description felt uncomfortably familiar, like looking in a mirror that showed not your reflection but your essential nature stripped of all the details that made you individual. Goku remained silent, afraid that speaking would break whatever trance Beerus had fallen into, and equally afraid of what he'd hear if the story continued. He achieved something remarkable, the god said quietly. A transformation beyond anything his species had ever reached before. He touched power that mortals weren't meant to possess, power that existed in the space between mortal limitation and divine essence. We have a name for it, though we use it rarely because speaking of it feels like inviting disaster. Divine severance. The words hung in the air between them, and Goku felt them settle into his awareness like seeds taking root in dark soil. There was power in the name itself, a weight that suggested significance beyond mere terminology. This wasn't just another transformation, another technique to be learned and mastered. This was something fundamental, something that changed the rules rather than just playing by them more effectively. What does it do? The question emerged before Goku could stop it, driven by that old familiar hunger to understand, to know, to reach for whatever lay beyond his current grasp. Even as the words left his mouth, he saw something flash across Beerus's face. Recognition, resignation, the look of someone watching history repeat itself despite their best efforts. That's exactly what he asked, Beerus said, and his voice carried a sadness so profound it made Goku's chest ache. When I first told him about the legends, the whispers among the gods about a power that transcended the boundaries between mortal and divine, he wanted to know what it could do, how it worked, whether he could reach it. And I didn't take him seriously enough. I thought it was impossible, that the legends were just stories we told ourselves to make the cosmos feel more mysterious than it actually was. The god paused, and when he continued, each word felt like it cost him something. Divine severance does exactly what its name suggests. It severs the divine from mortal limitation, creating something that exists in both states simultaneously. A being with a mortal's growth potential and drive, combined with a god's freedom from the rules that govern normal existence. It sounds miraculous, doesn't it? Like the answer to every limitation, every ceiling you've ever hit. Goku nodded slowly, unable to deny that something in him responded to the description with visceral longing. How many times had he crashed against the walls of his own potential, frustrated by the slow pace of improvement, desperate to find the next breakthrough, the idea of a power that could shatter those limitations entirely. But there's a cost, Beerus said, and his voice had gone flat, empty of everything except remembered horror. There's always a cost. Divine severance doesn't just separate you from mortal limitations, it separates you from everything that makes you mortal. Your memories begin to fragment. Your connections to others fade like dreams on waking. Your sense of self, the core identity that makes you, starts to dissolve. And the power doesn't care. It keeps growing, keeps expanding, seeking to correct reality itself according to whatever logic governs it. The stars seemed colder suddenly, the silence more profound. Goku found himself thinking about everyone he cared about: Chi-Chi's exasperated affection, Gohan's quiet pride, Goten's enthusiastic energy, Krillin's steadfast friendship, Vegeta's fierce rivalry. The thought of forgetting them, of having those connections simply cease to exist in any meaningful way, was more terrifying than any physical threat he'd ever faced. The warrior I'm telling you about, Beerus continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, he achieved divine severance. I don't know how. Perhaps he discovered some ancient technique. Perhaps he simply pushed himself so far beyond normal limits that the transformation triggered spontaneously. But once it began, there was no stopping it. What happened to him? Goku asked, though part of him already knew the answer, could feel it in the weight of Beerus's silence. He destroyed 17 planets before anyone could stop him. The words fell like stones into still water, rippling outward with implications that Goku struggled to fully process. Not because he was malicious or evil. Because he'd ceased to understand what planets were, what life meant, why destruction should matter. He saw inconsistencies in reality, and sought to correct them. He found flaws in existence itself, and tried to smooth them away. And with every correction, every alteration, more of what made him himself burned away until there was nothing left but the power wearing his shape. Goku felt his hands trembling and clasped them together, pressing palm against palm as though he could physically contain the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. How did you stop him? I didn't. Beerus's admission carried the weight of ancient guilt. I tried. I fought him with everything I had, used techniques I'd been saving for the end of the universe itself. But divine severance exists partially outside the rules that govern destruction, and I couldn't touch him. Not meaningfully. Not in any way that mattered. Then who? The Grand Priest. The name fell like a thunderclap in the small space between them. He came personally, which should tell you everything about how serious the situation had become. The Grand Priest doesn't interfere with individual mortals. He operates on the scale of entire universes, of reality itself. But this warrior had become a threat to the fundamental structure of existence, and so the Grand Priest removed him. The pause before that last word suggested volumes about what removal entailed. Goku had met the Grand Priest briefly, felt the weight of power that made even Xeno seem comprehensible by comparison. The idea of that being turning his attention to an individual mortal, focusing the full weight of his authority on erasing someone from existence. It wasn't destruction, Beerus said, as though reading Goku's thoughts. Destruction would have been mercy. The Grand Priest unmade him. Not killed, not erased, but undefined. He ceased to exist not just in the present but retroactively, as though he'd never been real in the first place. Except for those of us who'd witnessed it, who'd fought against him and failed to stop him, we remember. We're forced to remember, as a lesson in what happens when mortals touch powers they were never meant to possess. The horror of it settled over Goku like a suffocating blanket. To be unmade, to have your existence retroactively denied while others retained the memory of what you'd been. It was a fate beyond death, beyond any ending he'd ever contemplated. It was the ultimate negation, the final proof that you shouldn't have existed at all. Why are you telling me this? Goku asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Beerus finally met his eyes, and in that gaze Goku saw fear, raw, unguarded, the kind of terror that transcended pride or dignity. Because I've seen traces of it in you. During our fights, during your transformation into Ultra Instinct, I've felt the edges of something else. Something dormant but growing, like a seed taking root in darkness. You're approaching the threshold where divine severance becomes possible, and if you cross it, when you cross it, because I know you, Goku, I know how you approach every limit like it's a personal challenge. There won't be anything I can do to save you. The accusation wasn't angry or judgmental. It was simply true, spoken with the certainty of someone who'd watched history prepare to repeat itself and felt powerless to prevent it. Goku wanted to deny it, to insist that he never seek such a power, never risk losing himself so completely. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped by the knowledge that he'd made similar promises before. How many times had he assured Chi-Chi he'd be careful, that he wouldn't take unnecessary risks? How many times had he sworn to be there for his sons, only to prioritize training or fighting over family? How many times had he encountered a new technique, a new transformation, a new height to reach and told himself this will be the last one before immediately beginning to search for what lay beyond it? I need you to promise me something, Beerus said, and his voice carried a vulnerability that made him seem less like a god and more like someone who'd lost something precious and couldn't bear the thought of losing it again. I need you to swear, on everything you hold dear, that you will never deliberately seek divine severance. No matter how desperate the situation becomes, no matter how powerful the enemy you face, no matter how many people need saving. You will not open that door. The request hung between them, weighted with implications Goku was only beginning to understand. It wasn't just about power or safety. It was about identity, about the fundamental question of whether the ends could ever justify means that required you to stop being yourself. Could he save everyone he loved if the cost was forgetting why he loved them? Could he protect the universe if doing so meant ceasing to understand what made the universe worth protecting? I promise, Goku heard himself say, and the words felt both utterly sincere and fundamentally hollow, because even as he spoke them, he could feel something stirring in the depths of his consciousness. Not the power itself, not yet, but the awareness of it. Like discovering you have a muscle you never knew existed, and once you know it's there, you can't quite forget it again. Beerus studied him for a long moment, searching for something in his expression. Whatever he found there didn't seem to satisfy him, but he nodded anyway, accepting the promise for what it was. Genuine intent without any guarantee of follow-through. Good, the god said quietly. Though I suspect we both know how much that promise is worth when you're faced with losing someone you can't bear to lose. The brutal honesty of it made Goku flinch. He thought about Krillin dying on Namek, the rage that had consumed him. He thought about Gohan broken and beaten by the androids in that terrible future timeline, the helplessness that had driven him to train until his body broke. He thought about Universe 7 hanging by a thread during the Tournament of Power, knowing that one mistake could erase everything and everyone he'd ever known. In each of those moments, would a promise to a god have stopped him from reaching for whatever power could change the outcome? He wanted to believe it would, but the wanting itself revealed the doubt. You should eat, Beerus said abruptly, and the sudden return to mundane concerns felt jarring after the weight of their conversation. You're looking pale. And I didn't come here to watch you collapse from low blood sugar. Despite everything, Goku found himself laughing, a short, startled sound that broke some of the tension coiled in his chest. "You want some of that ramen? I suppose I could tolerate it," Beerus said with theatrical reluctance, though his relief at the change in subject was obvious. "If only to ensure you eat something before doing something stupid like training yourself unconscious while brooding about what I've told you." They moved to the small shelter King Kai maintained on his planet, more of a glorified hut than anything, but it had a working stove and bowls and the basic necessities for meals shared between warriors who'd long since stopped standing on ceremony with each other. Goku prepared the instant ramen with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for combat techniques, grateful for the simple task that didn't require him to examine the maelstrom of thoughts threatening to overwhelm him. Beerus ate in silence, and for a while either of them spoke. The only sounds were the quiet slurp of noodles, the clink of chopsticks against ceramic, the almost inaudible whisper of wind that shouldn't exist on a planet with no atmosphere. It was companionable in its way, the shared understanding that sometimes the most important conversations needed space to settle before they could be fully processed. "Did he have a family?" Goku asked finally, the question emerging from some part of him that needed to understand the full scope of what had been lost. "The warrior you told me about. Did he have people who missed him after?" Beerus set down his bowl carefully, his movements precise in the way of someone controlling strong emotion. "He had a daughter. Young, maybe 5 or 6 in mortal years. She was at home when the transformation completed, when he ceased to be himself and became something else. She was among the survivors we evacuated before the Grand Priest arrived." The god paused, and when he continued, his voice had gone very quiet. The unmaking didn't just erase him from the present. It erased him from her memory too. Retroactively. She grew up without a father, and the truly cruel part is that she never knew she was supposed to have one. The absence where he should have been simply wasn't. It ceased to exist as a thing that could be mourned. Goku felt something crack inside his chest. He thought about Gohan, about the times he missed in his son's life because of training or death, or simply not being present. He thought about Goten, who never really known his father until Goku had returned from the afterlife. The idea that they might forget him entirely, that the absence where he'd been wouldn't even register as loss. "That's the real horror of divine severance," Beerus said, watching Goku's face with something that might have been sympathy. "It doesn't just destroy you. It erases the possibility of you having mattered. Everyone who ever loved you forgets they had a reason to. Everything you accomplished becomes unattributable, like it happened spontaneously without cause or origin. You don't die. You cease to have been." The noodles had gone cold in Goku's bowl, but he couldn't bring himself to care. His appetite had vanished entirely, replaced by a hollow feeling that had nothing to do with physical hunger. "How do you live with that?" he asked quietly. "Knowing you couldn't save him. Knowing what happened to his daughter." "Poorly," Beerus admitted. "I've destroyed planets for far less than the crimes he committed under the influence of divine severance. But those were choices made by beings in full possession of themselves. He wasn't himself anymore. The person I failed to save was already gone long before the Grand Priest arrived. I was just too stubborn to admit it." The god stood abruptly, setting his bowl aside with a finality that suggested the meal was over even if either of them had finished eating. "That's why I'm telling you this now, Goku. Before you get any closer to that threshold. Before the situation becomes desperate enough that you start weighing the cost of losing yourself against the cost of losing others. Because once you begin that calculation, once you start thinking in those terms, you've already begun the process of severance. You've already started convincing yourself that the ends justify any means." Goku stood as well, his body moving automatically even as his mind struggled to process everything he'd learned. "What if there's no other choice?" he asked, the question emerging from some place of brutal honesty he rarely accessed. "What if I face an enemy I can't defeat, and everyone I care about is about to die, and divine severance is the only option?" "Then everyone dies," Beerus said flatly. "And you mourn them, and you live with the guilt, and you carry the weight of that failure for whatever remains of your life. Because at least then, you're still you. At least then, their deaths mean something because there's someone left who remembers them, who can grieve them, who can honor what they meant." The words should have been cold, should have felt like callous dismissal of legitimate concern. Instead, they landed with the weight of hard-earned wisdom, the kind of truth that only came from experiencing the alternative and finding it infinitely worse. I should go, Beerus said, and the statement felt less like a farewell and more like a retreat. Whis will wonder where I've disappeared to, and I'd prefer not to explain that I spent the evening terrifying my favorite mortal with cautionary tales from the deep past. Favorite? Goku managed a weak smile despite everything, grateful for even the smallest attempt at levity. You've got favorites now? Don't let it go to your head, Beerus replied, but there was genuine fondness in his voice beneath the affected dismissiveness. You're still tremendously irritating most of the time. But you're also. You remind me that mortals are capable of remarkable things when they choose to remain themselves rather than transcending into something greater and losing everything that made them worth knowing in the process. He placed a hand on Goku's shoulder, brief contact that conveyed more than words could manage. Remember what I've told you tonight. Remember it when you're faced with impossible choices and desperate circumstances. Remember that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And most importantly, remember that being strong enough to walk away from ultimate power is sometimes the greatest strength of all. Then he was gone, vanishing with the casual authority of someone for whom space and distance were more suggestions than limitations. Goku stood alone in the quiet aftermath, surrounded by the detritus of their interrupted meal and the weight of revelations he wasn't sure how to carry. He walked back outside, staring up at the impossible stars that wheeled overhead in patterns that would never be visible from Earth. His hands felt empty again, but the emptiness had changed somehow. It was no longer the frustrated absence of a challenge unmet, or a height unreached. It was something closer to awareness, the recognition that there were spaces in existence that shouldn't be filled, questions that shouldn't be answered, powers that should remain forever beyond mortal grasp. But even as he tried to embrace that wisdom, he felt it stirring in the depths of his consciousness: curiosity, hunger, the old familiar drive to understand what lay beyond every horizon. Divine severance. The words echoed in his thoughts, taking on weight and significance with each repetition. A power that could separate mortal limitation from divine potential, that could make him strong enough to face any threat without fear of failure. The cost would be everything he was. His memories, his connections, his sense of self. All of it burned away to fuel a power that wouldn't even remember why it had sought strength in the first place. I won't, Goku whispered to the empty air, making a promise to himself that felt somehow more binding than the one he made to Beerus. No matter what happens, no matter how desperate things get, I won't reach for it. I won't lose myself like that. But as he stood there beneath alien stars, feeling the pulse of his own mortality in every heartbeat, a small traitorous voice in the back of his mind whispered a question he couldn't quite silence. What if you have to? What if it's the only way? He pushed the thought away, turned back toward King Kai's dwelling with the intention of sleeping off the emotional exhaustion of the evening. But sleep, when it finally came hours later, was troubled by dreams of power that felt both seductive and terrifying, of transformation that promised everything and cost more than he could imagine paying. And in those dreams he felt it. The presence Beerus had warned him about, dormant but growing, waiting with infinite patience for the moment when desperation would overwhelm wisdom, and he'd reach for the power that promised to save everyone while destroying the person who'd wanted to save them in the first place. The night wore on, and Goku dreamed of doors that could never be closed once opened, of powers that consumed everything they touched, and of a warrior whose name had been forgotten but whose fate served as a warning across millions of years of cosmic history. A warning that Goku had every intention of heeding. He just wasn't sure he'd be strong enough to keep that intention when it truly mattered. 3 months had passed since Beerus's warning, and in that time, Goku had discovered that knowledge could be its own kind of curse. There were things you could learn that changed the shape of every moment afterward, that turned ordinary experiences into constant reminders of what you now knew but wished you didn't. Divine severance had become that for him, a specter that haunted the edges of every training session, every quiet moment, every time he pushed his body toward transformation and felt something deeper stirring in response. The training ground near Capsule Corporation had become his refuge in these months, though refuge felt like the wrong word for a place where he drove himself to the point of collapse with a frequency that bordered on obsessive. Chi-Chi had noticed, of course. She always noticed when something was eating at him, even if she couldn't identify exactly what. But she'd stopped asking after the third or fourth deflection, accepting his vague assurances that he was just working through some new techniques with the weary resignation of someone who'd long since learned that her husband's relationship with training existed in realms she couldn't fully access. Vegeta noticed too, but his response was characteristically different. The Saiyan Prince watched Goku with eyes that missed nothing, cataloging every extra hour spent in training, every session that pushed past exhaustion into something that looked almost like punishment. There was a quality to Goku's movements lately that set off alarm bells in Vegeta's combat-honed instincts. A searching desperation that made each victory feel incomplete, each new technique insufficient before it was even fully mastered. They were sparring now, as they did most evenings, and the familiar rhythm of their exchanges should have been comforting. Vegeta's style was aggressive precision, all sharp angles and calculated risks, while Goku tended toward fluidity and adaptation. Together they created a dynamic that had been refined over decades of rivalry and partnership, each knowing the other's tendencies well enough to predict and counter almost instinctively. But tonight something was different. Goku's movements had an edge to them, a probing quality that went beyond normal competitive drive. He wasn't just fighting Vegeta. He was fighting through him, using their sparring session as a vehicle to explore something deeper, something internal that manifested in the external world of fists and energy. "You're distracted," Vegeta said, blocking a strike that came in at an awkward angle, lacking Goku's usual precision. "Your form is sloppy. If I didn't know better, I'd think you were deliberately fighting poorly." "Just trying something new," Goku replied, but the explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears. He launched into a combination that should have flowed naturally but instead felt disjointed, as though his body and mind were operating on slightly different frequencies. Vegeta's eyes narrowed, reading the lie for what it was. But he didn't press, instead responding with a surge of power that forced Goku to focus or risk being overwhelmed. Their energies clashed, blue meeting blue as they both accessed Super Saiyan Blue simultaneously. The transformation is natural now as breathing after years of practice. Yet even in this state, with godly power coursing through every cell, Goku felt it. That hollow sensation that had been growing since his conversation with Beerus. Like he was pressing against a ceiling he couldn't see, reaching for something just beyond his grasp. Ultra Instinct had felt like the answer once, like the culmination of everything he'd been striving toward. But lately, even that legendary technique felt like a stepping stone rather than a destination. They broke apart, both breathing hard, and Vegeta studied him with an intensity that made Goku want to look away. "What did Beerus tell you?" the prince asked abruptly, the question catching Goku off guard with its directness. "What makes you think?" "Don't insult my intelligence, Kakarot." Vegeta's voice carried an edge of frustration. "You've been different since that night 3 months ago when you came back from King Kai's planet, training harder, pushing yourself more recklessly, but with none of the joy you usually show. You fight like someone running from something rather than toward it. So I'll ask again, what did Beerus tell you?" For a long moment, Goku considered lying or deflecting again. But standing there in the fading light, facing the rival who knew him better than almost anyone, he found he didn't have the energy for deception. "He told me about a power I should never seek. A transformation that could make me stronger than anything we faced, but would cost everything." The admission hung between them, weighted with implications neither wanted to fully examine. Vegeta's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked almost like fear, though he'd never admit to such a thing. "And you're tempted," Vegeta said flatly. Not a question, a statement of observed fact. "No," Goku started to say, but the denial died on his lips when he met Vegeta's knowing gaze. "I don't know. Maybe. I promised him I wouldn't seek it out, and I meant that. But knowing it exists, knowing there's something beyond where I am now, is eating at you," Vegeta finished, his voice carrying a complicated mixture of understanding and disappointment. "Of course it is. You've never been able to leave a challenge alone, even when the sensible thing would be to walk away. It's what makes you insufferable and occasionally admirable in equal measure." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken history settling over them. How many times had they pushed each other past reasonable limits, driven by competition and pride and that fundamental need to prove they could transcend whatever boundaries existence tried to impose. The tournament of power, the battle with Jiren, Vegeta's own reckless pursuit of Ultra Instinct through his own path. All of it had been predicated on the assumption that there was always another height to Reach. Always one more transformation waiting to be discovered. But what Beerus had described wasn't a transformation in the traditional sense. It was an unmaking, a dissolution of self in service of power that wouldn't even remember why it had sought strength in the first place. The thought should have been horrifying enough to quash any temptation immediately. Should have been. I need to push harder, Goku said abruptly, the words emerging from some place of raw honesty he rarely accessed. I need to find my limits, understand where the edges are. Otherwise, I'll always be wondering what's on the other side. Vegeta's expression darkened. You're an idiot if you think you can dance along the edge of something like that without falling in. Some boundaries exist for a reason, Kakarot. Some powers should remain theoretical rather than tested. Since when do you believe in self-imposed limitations? Goku shot back, feeling defensive heat rise in his chest. You've pushed yourself to destruction and beyond more times than I can count. You literally let yourself be possessed by Babidi just to close the gap between us. Don't lecture me about restraint when you've never shown any yourself. The accusation landed with enough force that Vegeta actually flinched. For a moment, Goku thought the prince would lash out in anger, would let their argument escalate into the kind of destructive confrontation that usually ended with significant property damage and Bulma yelling at both of them. Instead, Vegeta's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weariness that aged him beyond his years. You're right. I've been reckless, driven by pride to the point of stupidity. And every time, it's cost me. Cost us. Majin Buu was released because of my arrogance. The Namekians suffered because I couldn't accept being second best. Even my own family has paid the price for my obsession with surpassing you. He met Goku's eyes with an honesty that felt almost painful in its rawness. So when I tell you to be careful about this power Beerus warned you away from, understand that I'm speaking from experience. I know exactly how seductive it is to believe that the next transformation, the next height, will be the one that finally makes you good enough. And I know what it's like to realize too late that you've sacrificed things that mattered in pursuit of something that doesn't. The confession struck something deep in Goku's chest, cutting through his defensive posturing to hit truth he'd been avoiding. Because Vegeta was right. They both had histories of pushing too far, of letting the pursuit of strength override considerations of safety or consequence. The difference was that Vegeta had learned, through painful experience, that some costs were too high to justify any benefit. One more round, Goku said quietly, not quite ready to admit defeat but also not willing to continue their argument. Then we'll call it for tonight. Vegeta studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly, accepting the unspoken truce. They settled back into fighting stances, and this time when they clashed, it was with the easy synchronization of long familiarity. But something had shifted in the dynamic. Where before Goku had been searching for something through their combat, now he was simply present in it, focused on the moment rather than whatever lay beyond it. They pushed each other hard, trading blows that would have shattered mountains if they'd connected with anything less durable than Saiyan physiology hardened by godly transformations. Energy blasts carved through the air, each one controlled with enough precision to avoid causing collateral damage, but powerful enough to demand full attention from its target. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, it happened. Goku felt something shift inside him, not dramatically, not with any warning or fanfare, but with the subtle certainty of a key turning in a lock that had been waiting to be opened. For just a moment, barely longer than the time it took to complete a breath, he felt it, a presence within himself that was vast and ancient and utterly alien, not malicious, not even particularly aware of him, but simply existing in the same space his consciousness occupied, like discovering you've been sharing a house with something you never knew was there. His ki flared without his conscious direction, blazing silver-white with an intensity that made the evening's shadows flee like living things. But this wasn't Ultra Instinct. The energy signature was wrong, the quality of power fundamentally different. Where Ultra Instinct felt like perfect flow, like becoming water that adapted to every circumstance, this felt like assertion, like declaring that reality should conform to his will rather than the other way around. The temperature around them dropped so suddenly and completely that frost formed on the rocks within a 20-meter radius, spreading outward in crystalline patterns that looked almost deliberate in their geometric perfection. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on a quality that made breathing feel laborious, as though the atmosphere was trying to decide whether it should exist as gas or something else entirely. Vegeta staggered backward, and for the first time in years, perhaps since their very first encounter on Earth, there was genuine, unguarded fear in his eyes. Not fear of Goku, exactly, but fear of whatever had just manifested through him, using his body as a conduit for power that shouldn't exist in the mortal realm. Kakarot, Vegeta said, and his voice came out hoarse, stripped of its usual arrogance. What was that? Goku opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His entire body felt wrong, as though his nervous system was trying to process sensory input it wasn't designed to handle. Every cell seemed to be vibrating at a frequency just slightly out of sync with the rest of reality, creating a sensation that was simultaneously nauseating and intoxicating. Then the moment passed. The silver-white energy dissipated, the temperature normalized, the oppressive quality of the air evaporated like morning fog under sunlight. Goku collapsed, his legs giving out without warning, and only Vegeta's reflexive lunge forward prevented him from cracking his head against the stone ground. "I'm fine," Goku gasped, though even he could hear the lie in the words. Nothing about what had just happened was fine. That presence he'd felt, that vast, sleeping thing that existed in the depths of his consciousness, had stirred. Not awakened, not fully, but shifted in its rest like something beginning to dream. And the worst part, the thing that made his hands shake and his breath come short, was that part of him wanted to find it again, wanted to dive back into that space and understand what he'd touched, what had touched him in return. The power he'd felt in that brief moment had been intoxicating in a way that transcended any transformation he'd achieved before. It had felt like possibility, like the answer to every limitation he'd ever encountered. It had felt exactly like what Beerus had warned him about. "You need to see a doctor," Vegeta said firmly, already pulling out his phone to contact Bulma. "Whatever just happened, it's not something you should be dealing with alone." "No," Goku protested, trying to stand but finding his body still unresponsive. "It's nothing. Just pushed Ultra Instinct too hard, that's all." The lie was transparent, and Vegeta's expression made it clear he wasn't buying it for a second. But he also recognized the stubborn set to Goku's jaw, the way he deflected when something truly worried him. Pushing would only make him retreat further, become more defensive. "Fine," Vegeta said, though his tone suggested the matter was far from settled. "But you're going to Bulma's medical facility for a scan. Non-negotiable. And if you collapse again, I'm dragging you there personally whether you consent or not." Goku wanted to argue, but the truth was that the episode had frightened him more than he wanted to admit. Not because of the physical symptoms, he'd endured far worse during training, but because of how right it had felt in the moment. How natural, how obvious, how inevitable. Like he'd been walking toward this his entire life without realizing it, and now that he'd glimpsed the destination, every step in any other direction would feel like moving backward. They made their way to Bulma's lab in silence, Vegeta supporting more of Goku's weight than either would acknowledge aloud. The evening had deepened into full night, and the stars overhead seemed to press down with unusual clarity, as though the cosmos itself was watching to see what he'd do next. The medical examination was thorough, and revealed precisely nothing. Bulma's instruments, designed to analyze everything from baseline human physiology to the exotic energies produced by godly transformations, found no anomalies. His key signature was normal. His cellular structure showed no damage. Even his brain activity patterns were consistent with his baseline readings. "I don't understand," Bulma said, studying the readouts with growing frustration. "According to every test I've run, you're in perfect health. Better than perfect, actually. Your cellular regeneration is operating at slightly elevated efficiency compared to your last full physical. But Vegeta said you collapsed, that your energy went haywire, that the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. That doesn't just happen without leaving some kind of trace." Maybe he was lying for attention, Vegeta suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. They all knew what he'd witnessed was real, even if the instruments couldn't capture evidence of it. Goku remained silent, staring at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. He could still feel the echo of that presence, like an afterimage burned into his awareness that refused to fade. It was waiting, he realized, not actively, not with any malice, but with the patient inevitability of something that knew it would be called upon eventually. "Go home," Bulma said finally, recognizing when she'd hit the limits of what her equipment could detect. Get some rest. If it happens again, call me immediately. And Vegeta, she fixed her husband with a look that brooked no argument. You keep an eye on him during training. Whatever this is, it triggered during combat, which means it could happen again under similar circumstances. They parted ways outside the lab, and for a moment, Vegeta looked like he wanted to say something more. Some warning or piece of advice that might prevent Goku from making whatever mistakes seemed to be looming on the horizon. But in the end, he just shook his head and flew off toward his own home, leaving Goku alone with the night and his thoughts. The flight back to his house should have been peaceful. The air was cool, the sky clear, and from this height, the lights of civilization spread out below like a reflection of the stars above. But Goku found no comfort in the familiar journey. Instead, he kept thinking about that moment, the shift, the presence, the sense of touching something that existed beyond normal boundaries. Chi-Chi was already asleep when he arrived home, which was both a relief and a disappointment. He wanted to talk to her, to confess his fears and receive whatever wisdom or comfort she might offer. But he also knew that explaining what had happened would require admitting to things he wasn't ready to voice aloud. That he'd felt something forbidden, that part of him had wanted to embrace it, that even now he was thinking about how to find it again rather than how to avoid it. Instead of going to bed, he found himself in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkness beyond. Somewhere out there, Beerus was sleeping or destroying planets, or doing whatever gods of destruction did when mortals weren't occupying their attention. Did he know what had happened tonight? Could he sense when someone touched the edges of divine severance? Or was Goku's experience too subtle to register on whatever cosmic awareness Beerus possessed? The questions multiplied in his mind, each one branching into a dozen more until he felt like he was drowning in uncertainty. And underneath it all, that presence continued to pulse in the depths of his consciousness, not demanding attention, not forcing itself forward, but simply existing as an option he could choose if he was desperate enough or curious enough or foolish enough. He'd promised Beerus he wouldn't seek it. He meant that promise, had spoken it with absolute sincerity. But he was beginning to understand something that terrified him. You didn't have to actively seek something for it to find you anyway. Sometimes doors opened from the other side, pulled by circumstances or need or simply the inevitable momentum of who you were and what you wanted. And Goku had always wanted more. That night, sleep came reluctantly and brought with it dreams that felt less like random neural firing and more like glimpses of something real. He stood in darkness so absolute it felt solid, pressing against him from all directions with suffocating pressure. But in the distance, or maybe deep inside himself, the dream logic made location meaningless. There was light, not warm or welcoming but cold and vast and utterly alien, like staring into the heart of a star that had forgotten how to produce heat. In the dream, he walked toward that light, each step requiring conscious effort as though he was moving through water or air that had been thickened to the consistency of honey. And with each step, he felt himself changing, not physically, but fundamentally. Memories became slippery, hard to hold. The names of people he loved blurred at the edges, like words written in sand being slowly erased by incoming tide. But the power was magnificent. With each step closer to that cold light, he felt limitations falling away like chains he hadn't known he was wearing. The ceiling that had pressed down on his potential his entire life, invisible but always present, always constraining, shattered and dissolved. He could feel what it would be like to exist without mortal weakness, to move through reality as something that operated by different rules than everything around it. In the dream, he reached the light and extended his hand toward it. The moment his fingers made contact, everything inverted. The darkness became blinding brightness. The silence became a roar that contained every sound that had ever existed, and he felt himself expanding, growing beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness into something vast and terrible and unstoppable. And then he saw her. Chi-Chi, standing in that impossible space, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. He tried to speak her name, but realized he couldn't remember it. Couldn't remember who she was or why she mattered. Couldn't access any of the memories that should have defined their relationship. She was just a figure in the light, another object in a reality that needed correcting, another inconsistency to be smoothed away. He woke with a start, gasping for air, his body drenched in sweat despite the cool temperature of the bedroom. Chi-Chi stirred beside him, making a questioning sound in her sleep but not fully waking. Goku lay still, trying to slow his racing heart, trying to shake off the lingering sense of wrongness the dream had left behind. But what disturbed him most wasn't the content of the dream, it was how seductive it had felt. Even now, fully awake and aware, part of him wanted to slip back into sleep and find that cold light again, wanted to take those steps and see what lay at the end of them, consequences be damned. The next morning came too soon and found him exhausted despite having technically slept. Chi-Chi noticed immediately, her eyes taking in the circles under his eyes and the tense set of his shoulders with the practiced assessment of someone who'd been reading his moods for decades. "Rough night?" she asked, setting breakfast on the table with more force than strictly necessary, her habitual response when worried but trying not to show it. "Just weird dreams," Goku replied, which was true if inadequate. "Nothing to worry about." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her weighing whether to press or let it go. In the end, she chose a middle path. "You've been training a lot lately. More than usual. If something's bothering you, you know you can talk to me about it, right?" The offer was genuine, delivered without judgment or expectation, and it made something in Goku's chest ache. How could he explain that he was wrestling with the temptation of a power that would make him forget she existed? How could he confess that some part of him was weighing the value of his memories against the promise of unlimited strength? "I know," he said instead, reaching across to squeeze her hand briefly. "I'm okay. Just working through some stuff. Nothing serious." The lie sat heavy in his mouth, but she accepted it with the same resigned grace she'd shown countless times before. He hated disappointing her, hated that his first instinct was always to deflect rather than share. But the alternative, admitting to the dangerous territory his thoughts were straying into, felt impossible. He spent the next few days trying to focus on normal training, avoiding anything that might trigger another episode like what had happened with Vegeta. But the caution felt cowardly, and he found himself pushing boundaries anyway, testing limits just to see where they were. Each session ended with him exhausted but also frustrated, like he was deliberately refusing to open a door he knew was there, knew would lead somewhere significant. Piccolo noticed the change and approached him one afternoon, while he was training alone in the wilderness far from any population centers. The Namekian had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong, to read emotional states in the spaces between words and actions. "You're fighting scared," Piccolo observed, settling onto a nearby rock with his characteristic economy of movement. "I've never seen you do that before. Even when facing enemies far stronger than you, you've always fought with confidence. But right now you're pulling your punches. Not against an opponent, against yourself." Goku paused mid-kata, caught off guard by how accurately Piccolo had identified what he'd been doing. "I'm just being careful. Learning to fight smarter instead of always going for maximum power." "Bullshit," Piccolo said flatly, and the bluntness of it made Goku actually laugh despite himself. "I've known you long enough to recognize when you're lying, and you're terrible at it. Something's eating at you. Has been for months. And from what I've observed, it's getting worse rather than better." For a moment, Goku considered telling him everything. The conversation with Beerus, the episode with Vegeta, the dreams that felt more like premonitions than random subconscious processing. Piccolo was one of the few people who might actually understand, who had his own history of wrestling with internal darkness, and emerging changed but still fundamentally himself. But the words wouldn't come. Because speaking it aloud would make it real in a way that keeping it internal didn't. It would be acknowledging that he was struggling with something serious, something potentially dangerous, rather than just working through a phase that would pass with enough time and discipline. "There's a technique I've been thinking about," he said instead, offering a partial truth. "Something that could make me a lot stronger, but it comes with complications. I'm trying to figure out if pursuing it is worth the risk." Piccolo's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "And these complications, they're serious enough that you're actually hesitating? That's not like you. Usually you just throw yourself in and deal with the consequences afterward." "Yeah, well, maybe I'm learning to think before acting for once," Goku replied, though even he could hear how unconvincing that sounded. "Or maybe," Piccolo said carefully, "whatever this technique is frightens you enough that even your recklessness has limits. Which means you should probably listen to that fear instead of trying to overcome it." The wisdom in those words struck deeper than Piccolo probably intended, because he was right. Goku's instinct was always to face fear head-on, to treat it as just another challenge to overcome through effort and determination. But what if the fear was trying to tell him something important? What if the hesitation wasn't weakness but wisdom, his subconscious recognizing danger that his conscious mind wanted to dismiss? They trained together for a while after that, and Piccolo's style, all precision and control, every movement deliberate and purposeful, felt like an antidote to Goku's recent spiral into obsessive intensity. There was something grounding about fighting someone who mastered the balance between power and restraint, who never wasted motion or energy on displays that served pride rather than purpose. But even that reprieve was temporary. As the sun set and Piccolo left to attend to other responsibilities, Goku found himself alone again with his thoughts. And in that solitude, that presence within him pulsed like a second heartbeat, patient, inevitable, waiting. He made a decision then, born of desperation and the terrifying realization that passive avoidance wasn't working. If he couldn't stop thinking about divine severance, couldn't prevent himself from drifting toward it through some combination of curiosity and subconscious seeking, then he needed to understand it, needed to know exactly what it was and what it would cost, so that if the moment came when he was tempted to reach for it, he'd make that choice with full awareness rather than desperate ignorance. The room of spirit and time called to him with its promise of isolation and unlimited time to explore without external consequence. He could spend a year in there, a day outside, and emerge with answers that might help him navigate this dangerous territory. Or at least, that's what he told himself as he made his way to Kami's lookout under cover of darkness, not wanting to explain to anyone where he was going or why. The ancient structure was deserted this late, and Mr. Popo was nowhere to be seen as Goku approached the door to the room of spirit and time. The entrance seemed to pulse with potential, or maybe that was just his imagination overlaying meaning onto an ordinary doorway. He hesitated with his hand on the frame, questioning whether this was wisdom or the first step toward exactly what he'd promised Beerus he wouldn't do, but the need to understand won out over caution. He stepped through, and reality shifted around him in that distinctive way that marked transition into the room's pocket dimension. The vast white emptiness spread out in all directions, featureless and infinite, a blank canvas where the only limit was what you brought with you. Goku settled into meditation immediately, seeking that presence he'd felt during the episode with Vegeta. In the complete isolation of the room, with no distractions or external stimuli to fragment his attention, finding it should be easier. Or so he thought. Hours passed, impossible to track in this timeless space, but he felt them accumulating in the ache of his legs and the gradual deepening of his meditative state. His awareness sank through layers of consciousness he rarely accessed, past the surface thoughts and immediate sensations, past the reactive patterns that governed combat and daily life, down into depths where his sense of self became fuzzy and uncertain. And there, in that deepest layer, he found it. The presence was exactly as he remembered. Vast and ancient and utterly alien, like staring into an ocean that had no bottom and no shore. But experiencing it in meditation, with full conscious attention rather than in the chaos of combat, revealed details he'd missed before. This wasn't just power waiting to be claimed. It was something closer to a door standing permanently ajar, leading to a space that existed outside normal reality's boundaries. In his mind's eye, he approached that door cautiously, like someone investigating a structure that might collapse at any moment. The doorway was wreathed in light so intense it bordered on darkness, not black, but rather a white so absolute it became its own form of absence. Through the opening, he could sense what lay beyond: power without limit, strength without constraint, the ability to reshape reality according to will rather than accepting it as given. And then, impossibly, something looked back at him. Not consciousness exactly. Whatever existed beyond that door didn't think in any way he could recognize as thought, but it became aware of his awareness, responding to his attention with something that felt like invitation? Curiosity? The emotional tenor was impossible to read, like trying to understand what a mountain felt or what concept motivated gravity. A voice emerged from that space, though calling it a voice was inadequate. It was more like meaning being impressed directly into his consciousness, bypassing the need for language or sound. The message was simple and terrible in its simplicity. I can help you protect them. All of them. No enemy will threaten what you love. No loss will ever touch you again. You need only accept what I offer, and everything you fear will become impossible. The offer hung in the space of his meditation, seductive in its directness. How many times had he failed to protect someone? How many loved ones had died while he was too weak, too slow, too limited to save them? Krillin on Namek, reduced to nothing while Goku could only watch. Gohan battered and broken in that future timeline where the androids reigned. His own death against Cell, knowing his family would have to go on without him. All of that could be prevented. All of it could be rendered impossible by accepting what lay beyond that door. He'd never have to choose between loved ones again, never have to prioritize one person's safety over another's, never have to live with the guilt of not being strong enough when it mattered most. The temptation was so intense it felt physical, like gravity pulling him toward that doorway. His metaphysical hand, the part of consciousness that interacted with this internal landscape, reached out almost without his volition, fingers stretching toward the light that promised everything. And in that moment, a memory surfaced unbidden, Chi-Chi's face as she looked at him that morning, worry evident despite her attempts to hide it. The specific quality of her expression, the way her eyes had searched his face for signs of whatever was troubling him. The simple human concern of someone who loved him and wanted him to be okay. If he accepted what was being offered, he would forget that expression. Would forget what it meant, why it mattered, what history of shared experience gave it significance. Chi-Chi would become just another face, another piece of reality to be catalogued and dismissed. The love that made her concern meaningful would burn away in service of power that couldn't comprehend why love should matter in the first place. Goku jerked his hand back, severing the meditation with enough force that he actually gasped aloud, his physical body reacting to mental trauma. He found himself sprawled on the white floor of the room of spirit and time, chest heaving, hands shaking, every nerve screaming warnings about what he'd almost done, because he'd been about to do it. In that moment, hovering at the threshold, he'd been a hair's breadth from accepting, from opening that door fully and stepping through into a transformation that would save everyone except the person doing the saving. The realization crashed over him like cold water, shocking him out of whatever trance he'd fallen into. This wasn't like his other transformations, moments of pressure and desperate need that triggered changes he could integrate and control. This was seduction, slow and patient, wearing away resistance through constant exposure until the moment came when saying yes felt inevitable rather than chosen. He spent the rest of his time in the room, days that passed in the space of hours outside, not training but simply sitting with what he'd learned. The presence was still there, still accessible, still offering its terrible bargain. But now he understood the shape of the temptation, could recognize the voice when it whispered promises in the back of his mind. Knowledge was supposed to be power, but in this case, it felt more like burden, because now he knew exactly what he was resisting, knew what he was giving up by refusing, knew that in moments of true desperation, that knowledge would make the temptation even stronger rather than weaker. When he emerged from the room, Mr. Popo was waiting by the entrance, his ancient eyes knowing in ways that suggested he understood more than he was saying. They exchanged no words, but in the lookout's guardian's slight nod, Goku read acknowledgement of something significant having occurred. The flight home felt longer than it should have, weighted with new understanding that made everything seem slightly different. The world below was beautiful and fragile, filled with people living ordinary lives, none of them knowing how close one of their protectors had come to becoming something that couldn't remember why they needed protecting. Chi-Chi was in the kitchen when he arrived, preparing dinner with the efficient movements of long practice. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment, Goku just stared at her, really looked, cataloging every detail as though seeing her for the first time. The strand of hair that always escaped her ponytail, the particular way she held the cooking utensils, the expression she wore when focused on a task, concentration mixed with the faint satisfaction of competence. All of it could have been lost. All of it still could be, if he wasn't careful, if he let his guard down at the wrong moment. "You're staring," Chi-Chi said, a smile tugging at her lips despite the words being mildly accusatory. "Something on my face?" "No," Goku said quietly, moving to wrap his arms around her from behind, an unusual gesture for him, public displays of affection never having come naturally. "Just grateful you're here." She stiffened in surprise at the uncharacteristic behavior, but then relaxed into the embrace, one hand coming up to pat his arms where they crossed over her stomach. "Well, where else would I be? This is my house too, you know." The mundane response was perfect in its ordinariness, grounding him in the reality of daily life that continued regardless of cosmic threats or divine warnings. This was what mattered, not power or transformation or the ability to face any enemy without fear of loss. Just this, the simple miracle of being himself, connected to people who knew him and loved him and would miss him if he ceased to exist. That night, lying in bed with Chi-Chi's breathing deepening into sleep beside him, Goku stared at the ceiling and made a different kind of promise than the one he'd given Beerus. Not a vow to avoid divine severance. That felt increasingly untenable as time passed and circumstances evolved, but rather a promise to remember, in whatever moment of desperation might eventually come, exactly what he'd be giving up. Because he understood now, with terrible clarity, that the question wasn't whether he'd face a situation desperate enough to tempt him into reaching for forbidden power. The question was whether, in that moment, he'd remember why he should refuse. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the struggles of one mortal trying to navigate the space between limitation and transcendence. And deep inside Goku's consciousness, that presence continued to pulse, patient, inevitable, waiting for the day when desperation would finally overwhelm wisdom and the door would open fully. That day was coming. They both knew it. The only question was what Goku would choose when it arrived. The morning arrived with an unsettling quality that Goku couldn't quite articulate. A wrongness in the air that had nothing to do with weather or temperature but rather some fundamental disturbance in the fabric of reality itself. He'd woken before dawn, dragged from uneasy sleep by a sensation that lived somewhere between physical discomfort and existential dread, and now stood on the porch of his home watching the sun struggle to rise through a sky that seemed slightly off-color, as though someone had adjusted the saturation of the world and forgotten to correct it back. Chi-Chi was still sleeping, which was fortunate because he had no idea how he'd explain the tension coiled in his shoulders, the way his entire body had gone on alert for reasons his conscious mind couldn't identify. This wasn't the familiar anticipation of approaching combat. He'd experienced that enough times to recognize its particular flavor. This was something else, something that set his teeth on edge and made his ki feel restless beneath his skin, like it was trying to orient itself toward a threat it could sense but not locate. The coffee in his hands had gone cold while he'd stood there, lost in the uncomfortable awareness that something fundamental had shifted in the universe. He'd learned to trust these instincts over the years, the way his body registered danger long before his mind could process and analyze it. The sensation had saved his life more times than he could count, warned him of approaching enemies or imminent attacks with enough advance notice to prepare or react. But this was different. The threat wasn't approaching. It was already here, had already arrived, and was simply waiting to reveal itself. His phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the uneasy silence. Vegeta's name flashed on the screen, and Goku answered already knowing this wasn't a social call. "You feel it?" Vegeta's voice was tight, stripped of its usual arrogance, and replaced by the focused intensity he only displayed when genuinely concerned. "Yeah," Goku replied quietly, glancing back toward the house to ensure Chi-Chi hadn't woken. "Don't know what it is though. Just that something's wrong. The Supreme Kai just contacted me. There's been a dimensional rupture somewhere in Universe 7, a tear in the barrier that shouldn't be possible. He's gathering everyone at Capsule Corporation." There was a pause, and when Vegeta spoke again, his voice carried a quality that might have been fear if Goku hadn't known better than to attribute such an emotion to the Saiyan Prince. "Whis is there. He arrived before the Supreme Kai even called, which means it's serious enough that the angels are involved," Goku finished, feeling ice settle in his stomach. Whis rarely involved himself in mortal affairs unless the threat operated on a scale that transcended normal danger. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. He left a note for Chi-Chi, brief and deliberately vague, because what could he say that wouldn't just worry her more, and launched himself into the sky with enough force to crack the porch boards beneath his feet. The flight to West City should have been peaceful, the early morning air cool and clear, but instead he found himself constantly scanning the horizon for something he couldn't identify, some visual confirmation of the wrongness his instincts insisted was present. The others were already assembled when he arrived, Vegeta standing with arms crossed and expression closed, Piccolo with his usual contemplative intensity, Gohan looking both concerned and grimly prepared, even Krillin and 18 hovering at the edges of the group. The Supreme Kai stood at the center, his normally composed demeanor fractured by visible anxiety, while Whis observed everything with the serene detachment of someone who existed several steps removed from immediate concerns. "Good, you're here," the Supreme Kai said, relief evident in his voice. "We have a situation. Approximately 3 hours ago, sensors detected a massive dimensional disturbance near the outer rim of Universe 7. Something has torn through the barrier that separates our universe from the void beyond." "What kind of something?" Piccolo asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone already suspecting the answer wouldn't be reassuring. "That's the problem," the Supreme Kai admitted. "We don't know. The energy signature is unlike anything in our records. It doesn't match any known life form, any documented entity, anything that should exist within the normal parameters of reality. And it's not just present in our dimension. It's simultaneously existing in multiple dimensional states, as though it's only partially here," Whis interjected smoothly, his staff tapping against the ground with a sound that seemed to echo beyond the physical space they occupied. "Whatever has entered Universe 7 is maintaining a connection to wherever it originated, existing in a superposition of states that makes conventional detection and interaction complicated." The technical language obscured implications that Goku was only beginning to grasp, but Gohan's expression had gone very still, the way it did when his analytical mind was processing information that led to uncomfortable conclusions. "You're saying this thing exists in a quantum state? That it's not fully manifested in our reality?" "In simplified terms, yes," Whis confirmed. "Though the actual mechanism is considerably more complex than mere quantum uncertainty. This entity appears to exist in the spaces between dimensions, the gaps in reality that most beings cannot perceive or access. It has found a way to partially manifest without fully committing to existing within our universe's physical laws." Goku felt his hands clenching involuntarily, his combat instincts already cataloging the tactical nightmare such an opponent would present. "How did you fight something that wasn't entirely present? How did you land a blow against an enemy that existed partially outside the dimension where such things as blows had meaning? Where is it now?" Vegeta demanded, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone ready to confront the threat immediately regardless of its nature. "Moving toward the populated sectors," the Supreme Kai said, and the weight in those words silenced whatever response anyone might have offered. "Slowly, but with apparent purpose, and everywhere it passes there are effects. Reality becoming unstable. Small sections of planets beginning to, I don't know how else to describe it, forget they exist. Not destroyed, not erased, but simply ceasing to be as though they never were in the first place." The description sent a chill through Goku that had nothing to do with temperature. He thought about Beerus's warning, about the warrior who'd achieved divine severance and begun correcting reality according to his own internal logic. Was this related somehow, or just a different manifestation of the same fundamental problem, beings operating outside the normal rules, reshaping existence according to principles that made sense to them but spelled catastrophe for everything else? "Then we go to it," Goku said, the decision forming even as he spoke. "Stop it before it reaches anywhere populated. Figure out how to fight it along the way." Kakarot, Vegeta's voice carried a warning note. "We don't even know if conventional attacks will work against something that's only partially present in our dimension." "Then we find out," Goku replied, meeting his rival's eyes with the kind of fierce certainty that had carried him through impossible battles before. "Because waiting and planning doesn't help if people are disappearing while we hesitate." For a moment, he thought Vegeta would argue, would insist on caution and preparation. But instead, the prince just nodded sharply, recognizing the truth in Goku's assessment. Sometimes you had to act despite incomplete information, had to trust that you'd adapt once you understood the shape of the threat you were facing. They departed as a group, Goku, Vegeta, Gohan, Piccolo, even Krillin and 18 insisting on joining despite the obvious power differential. The Supreme Kai provided coordinates, and they flew toward the outer rim where the dimensional disturbance had first been detected, where something impossible had forced its way into reality, and was now moving with apparent deliberation toward populated worlds. The flight took longer than Goku would have liked, space being vast even when you could fly at speeds that defied normal physics. But eventually, they approached the coordinates the Supreme Kai had provided, and what they found there made even Goku's battle-hardened instincts recoil in something close to horror. The entity was visible from a distance, though visible felt like an inadequate description for something that seemed to flicker in and out of perceptibility moment by moment. It appeared as a roughly humanoid shape, taller than any of them, perhaps 3 meters at full extension. But its form was wrong in ways that made Goku's eyes hurt to track. The edges of its body blurred and shifted, as though reality couldn't quite decide on its boundaries. Colors that shouldn't exist played across its surface, and occasionally it would seem to phase partially out of sight, becoming translucent or disappearing entirely for heartbeats before re-solidifying. But what truly disturbed Goku was the space around the entity. Reality itself seemed damaged in its vicinity, like fabric that had been torn and imperfectly repaired. Small sections of the asteroid field they were passing through would suddenly vanish, not explode or fragment, but simply cease to exist as though they'd been edited out of the universe. And the entity moved through these gaps with fluid grace, as though the damaged reality was more natural to it than normal space. What is that? Krillin's voice was quiet, carrying the kind of primal unease that came from witnessing something fundamentally wrong. I am Calvex, the entity said, and its voice emerged from multiple points simultaneously, ahead of them, behind them, somehow inside Goku's own mind, though he knew intellectually that it was speaking aloud. I am what remains when a universe is deleted incompletely. I am the ghost of something that should not exist, but cannot cease existing either. The words hung in the void between them, weighted with implications Goku struggled to process. A deleted universe? He'd learned during the Tournament of Power that Zeno had erased entire universes before, but he'd assumed such erasure was absolute, final, leaving nothing behind. The idea that something could survive such deletion, even partially, even in this damaged state, was terrifying in ways he couldn't fully articulate. You don't belong here, Vegeta said, his voice hard despite the uncertainty Goku could sense beneath the words. Whatever you are, wherever you came from, this universe isn't yours. Leave, or we'll make you leave. Calvex's form rippled, and what might have been laughter echoed from multiple directions simultaneously. Make me leave? You don't understand what I am, what I've become. I exist partially outside your reality's rules. Your attacks, your power, your transformations, all predicated on laws that govern your dimension. I am not fully subject to those laws. How do you fight something that exists in the spaces between? There was no malice in the words, Goku realized with growing concern. Just statement of fact delivered with the kind of detached certainty that came from understanding your own nature completely. Calvex wasn't boasting. It was explaining why resistance would be futile. The way you might explain to a child why they couldn't lift something too heavy for them. We've fought gods, Goku said, stepping forward despite every instinct screaming that approaching this thing was dangerous. We've faced enemies that operated outside normal rules before. You're not the first impossible opponent we've encountered. Perhaps, Calvex replied, and its form flickered, becoming momentarily translucent before solidifying again. But I am not here to conquer or destroy. I am desperate, and that makes me more dangerous than any tyrant or destroyer you've faced. I need to exist again, fully, completely, not this half-present state where I'm trapped between being and not being. And to do that, I need a universe to anchor myself to. I need your reality to replace the one I lost. The admission should have been shocking, but somehow Goku had already suspected something along those lines. The damaged reality around Calvex, the way sections of space simply ceased to exist in its presence, those were signs of something trying to assert itself, to overwrite what was with what it needed to be. Not destruction but replacement, reality being edited to accommodate an entity that no longer had a proper home. We can't let you do that, Gohan said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet determination that reminded Goku of himself at that age. If you replace our universe, everyone in it, trillions of lives, would just cease to exist. We'd be erased the way your universe was. I know, Calvex said, and there was something that might have been sorrow in its multidirectional voice. I regret that your existence stands in the way of my restoration, but I have been trapped in the void between universes for eons, watching reality from outside its boundaries, unable to touch it or participate in it. You cannot understand what that's like. To exist without existing, to be conscious but unable to affect or be affected by anything. I will do whatever necessary to escape that state, even if it means your erasure. The honesty was almost worse than hostility would have been. At least with an enemy motivated by malice or conquest, you could hate them, could fight with the righteousness of opposing evil. But Calvex wasn't evil. It was desperate, driven by a need so fundamental that morality became irrelevant in the face of it. How did you fight someone who acknowledged the harm they'd caused but couldn't afford to care about it? Then we fight, Vegeta said simply, and there was a finality to the words that suggested the time for negotiation had passed. He powered up immediately, blue energy flooding through him as he accessed Super Saiyan Blue with the ease of long practice. We'll find a way to stop you, even if conventional attacks don't work. We always do. Calvex's form rippled again, and this time the movement carried a quality of preparation, of something settling into combat readiness even if the mechanisms of its fighting style remained unclear. Very well, I will defend myself as necessary. But understand, your attacks operate within your reality's framework. I exist partially outside that framework. The outcome is predetermined. The battle began without any clear signal, Vegeta launching himself forward with explosive speed that should have closed the distance in milliseconds. But as he approached, Calvex simply adjusted. Its form flickered, and suddenly Vegeta was flying through empty space, his punch connecting with nothing as the entity had ceased to exist in that particular location, had moved itself to a different point without actually traversing the space between. Goku watched with mounting concern as Vegeta tried again, combining instant transmission with overwhelming speed to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. Each strike should have connected, should have forced Calvex to defend or dodge conventionally. Instead, the entity simply wasn't there when the blows arrived, as though it could perceive attacks coming and retroactively ensure it had never been in their path. Piccolo joined the assault, his extendable arms allowing for unpredictable angles of attack while he fired energy blasts to limit Calvex's options for evasion. But even this coordinated assault seemed ineffective. The energy blasts would reach where Calvex was and then simply dissipate as though they'd struck a barrier that didn't exist in normal space, while Piccolo's physical strikes passed through the entity's form as though it were intangible. It's not dodging, Gohan observed, his analytical mind working to understand the mechanism even as he powered up to join the fight. It's not even defending, not really. It's existing in a state where the attacks never connect because it's not entirely present in the dimension where connection has meaning. The explanation was terrifying in its implications. How did you fight something that could simply choose not to exist in the space where your attacks landed? It wasn't speed or technique. It was operating according to different rules entirely. Playing a game where the basic assumptions about cause and effect no longer applied. Goku launched himself forward, pushing into Super Saiyan Blue and combining it with Kaioken to achieve speeds that made his previous movements look glacial by comparison. He struck from 17 different angles in the space of a second, each blow calculated to force Calvex into a position where evasion should be impossible. But Calvex didn't evade. It simply wasn't affected. Goku's fist passed through its form, and for the briefest moment, he felt something, a wrongness where his hand intersected with the entity's semi-present body, like touching emptiness that had texture, void that pushed back. Then his momentum carried him past, and he spun to find Calvex watching him with what might have been curiosity evident in its flickering, unstable form. You're fast, Calvex observed. Remarkably so for a mortal. But speed assumes linear causality, that you must travel from point A to point B, that action precedes reaction. I exist partially outside that causality. Your speed, however impressive, cannot overcome the fundamental advantage of operating by different rules. Then, before Goku could respond or adjust his strategy, Calvex moved. Not in the way beings normally moved, it didn't cross the distance between them. Instead, it was suddenly simply present in front of Goku, and its hand was reaching forward to touch his chest. The contact was wrong in ways that transcended physical sensation. Where Calvex's fingers met Goku's GI, reality became uncertain. He could feel his own existence wavering, becoming questionable, as though the universe itself was briefly unsure whether he should be there. The sensation lasted maybe 2 seconds, subjective time stretched thin and strange, before Goku managed to wrench himself backward, breaking contact through sheer force of will more than physical strength, but the effect lingered. Looking down at his chest, he saw that a section of his GI had simply ceased to exist, not burned away or torn, but edited out of reality, as though it had never been woven in the first place. And beneath that missing fabric, his skin showed similar damage, a patch about the size of Calvex's palm where his flesh was. flickering, existing and not existing in rapid alternation, as though his body couldn't quite decide whether that section should be present. Goku! Gohan's voice was sharp with alarm, and suddenly his son was there, pulling him back while Piccolo and Vegeta moved to intercept Calvex before it could follow up on whatever attack that had been. "I'm okay," Goku said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. The flickering section of his chest was stabilizing slowly, reality reasserting itself, but the sensation had been terrifying in its fundamental wrongness. For those 2 seconds he'd felt what it was like to have his existence questioned by the universe itself, to become uncertain about whether he was real or just a possibility that hadn't been properly eliminated. "That was a taste," Calvex said, its voice carrying something that might have been regret. "Of what I experience constantly. Existing but not existing, present but not present, trapped in uncertainty about my own reality." "You felt it for seconds. I have endured it for eons. Can you understand now why I must escape this state, regardless of cost?" The empathy Goku felt was unwelcome but genuine. He tried to imagine existing like that, consciousness intact but body uncertain, present in reality but unable to fully interact with it, awareness without anchor. The horror of such existence was almost enough to make him sympathize with Calvex's desperate need to restore itself, to replace uncertainty with solid presence even if that meant erasing an entire universe to accomplish it. Almost enough. But not quite. Because however terrible Calvex's existence might be, it didn't justify condemning trillions of innocent lives to the same erasure it had experienced. "There has to be another way," Goku said, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the lingering sensation of having his existence questioned. "Some method of restoring you that doesn't require destroying everything and everyone in Universe 7. If we work together." "There is no other way," Calvex interrupted, and its form pulsed with something that might have been frustration. "I have searched for alternatives for longer than your species has existed. The mechanics of my restoration are absolute. I need a universe to anchor to replace the one that was deleted. Your universe is here, and I am desperate enough to take it. Please don't make this more difficult than it must be." The polite phrasing of that last statement, "please," as though Calvex was asking a favor rather than threatening universal erasure, was somehow more disturbing than outright hostility would have been. This was an entity so far removed from conventional morality that it could acknowledge the harm it would cause while still viewing its own restoration as the only priority that mattered. Vegeta attacked again, this time combining physical strikes with a barrage of energy attacks dense enough that avoiding them all should have been impossible. But Calvex simply adjusted its existence, phasing partially out of reality until the attacks passed through spaces it no longer occupied. And when Vegeta tried to follow up with a final flash powerful enough to destroy a planet, Calvex did something that made everyone present freeze in horror. It reached out and touched the energy beam itself, and where its fingers made contact, the attack simply stopped. Not blocked or deflected, the energy didn't redirect or dissipate. It just ceased to exist, as though the universe had decided retroactively that Vegeta had never fired it in the first place. The beam vanished, and Vegeta was left staring at his hands with an expression that mixed disbelief with growing dread. "Energy attacks are still bound by causality," Calvex explained, as though offering a lesson to students who weren't quite grasping the material. "I can cause the universe to forget that causality. Your attack existed, then I made it so it never existed. From your perspective, it disappeared. From reality's perspective, it was never there to begin with." The implications were staggering. If Calvex could simply erase attacks from having happened, could make the universe forget that actions had been taken, then conventional combat was worse than useless. It was providing opportunities for Calvex to demonstrate its advantage. Every assault they launched, every technique they employed, could be retroactively eliminated as though it had never occurred. Goku felt his heart rate accelerating, combat instincts screaming warnings about an opponent they weren't equipped to handle. He'd faced enemies stronger than him before, had fought beings with overwhelming power or impossible techniques. But those had all operated within the same basic framework he did. They hit harder, moved faster, had more energy, but the fundamental rules remained consistent. This was different. This was fighting someone who could edit the rules themselves, who existed partially outside the structure that governed whether attacks succeeded or failed. "We need a new approach," Piccolo said quietly, his voice tight with controlled concern. Direct attacks aren't working. We need to find some way to force it fully into our dimension. Make it subject to the same rules we operate under. And how exactly do you propose we do that? Vegeta demanded, frustration evident in every syllable. We can barely touch it, and when we do, it starts erasing us from existence. Unless someone has a technique specifically designed for forcing dimensional entities into full manifestation, we're operating blind. Gohan's expression had gone distant, thoughtful in the way that meant his analytical mind was working through possibilities. The Supreme Kai said it's maintaining a connection to wherever it originated, existing in multiple states simultaneously. What if we could sever that connection, force it to commit to existing entirely in our dimension? Good theory, Krillin said, hovering at the edge of the group with 18 beside him, both of them clearly aware they were outclassed but unwilling to retreat. But how do you sever a connection to another dimension when we can barely affect the entity in the first place? The question hung unanswered because none of them had a solution. Goku could feel the weight of their collective uncertainty, the growing awareness that they were facing something genuinely beyond their ability to combat with conventional means. He'd always believed that sufficient determination and power could overcome any obstacle, that pushing hard enough and refusing to give up would eventually produce victory. But against an enemy that could simply choose not to be affected by your efforts, that could make the universe forget your attacks had ever occurred, what did determination accomplish? His hand drifted unconsciously to his chest, to the spot where his existence had briefly become uncertain. The flesh had stabilized, but he could still feel the echo of that wrongness, like a phantom sensation that wouldn't quite fade. And beneath that memory, stirring in the depths of his consciousness, he felt it. That presence Beerus had warned him about, that forbidden door he'd promised never to open. It was whispering now, quiet but insistent, suggesting that this was exactly the kind of situation where normal limits became unacceptable. Calvex operated outside conventional reality's rules, then he needed to do the same. The entity could erase attacks from causality? Then he needed power that existed beyond causality's reach. Divine severance wouldn't just make him stronger. It would fundamentally change what he was, allow him to meet Calvex on equal footing by stepping outside the normal framework just as it had. The temptation was stronger than it had been before, sharpened by desperation and the growing certainty that without some radical change in approach, they were going to lose. Not just this battle, but everything. Their universe replaced by Calvex's presence, reality itself edited to accommodate an entity that no longer had anywhere else to exist. No, Goku whispered to himself, so quietly that none of the others heard over the sound of Vegeta launching another futile assault against Calvex's semi-present form. Not yet. There has to be another way. There has to be. But even as he formed the thought, doubt gnawed at him. What if there wasn't another way? What if this was the crisis Beerus had obliquely warned about? The situation desperate enough that refusing to reach for divine severance meant accepting universal destruction. Could he really prioritize his own identity, his own humanity, over the survival of everything and everyone he'd ever known? The internal debate raged while around him. His friends and family continued throwing themselves against an enemy that seemed increasingly unstoppable. Gohan managed to land a solid hit after feinting with multiple afterimages. But when his fist connected, Calvex's form simply absorbed the impact without apparent damage, as though kinetic energy was just another thing it could choose not to be affected by. Piccolo tried binding it with his extending limbs, but the moment his arms wrapped around Calvex's body, sections of them began flickering in and out of existence, forcing him to release before the damage spread further up his limbs. And through it all, Calvex remained almost apologetic in its responses, as though it genuinely regretted having to defend itself against beings it viewed as inevitable casualties of its restoration. "I wish you would stop," it said after deflecting another of Vegeta's increasingly desperate combinations. "This is pointless. You cannot harm me meaningfully, and continuing only forces me to demonstrate why your efforts are futile. Please, accept what's coming. Make your peace with it. I will try to ensure the transition is quick, that your erasure involves minimal suffering." The offer was probably meant as kindness, some attempt at mercy from an entity that had moved so far beyond normal morality it couldn't quite remember how such things worked. But to Goku, it felt like pronouncement of inevitable defeat, like watching an execution and being told at least it would be quick. He pushed into ultra instinct without conscious decision, his body making the choice before his mind fully processed it. Silver energy flooded through him, and suddenly the world slowed to a crawl, every movement telegraphed in advance, every possibility mapped out in his awareness before it manifested physically. This was the technique that had allowed him to fight Jiren, to stand against an opponent whose power seemed absolute. Maybe applied to Calvex, it would reveal some opening, some vulnerability that conventional combat hadn't exposed. He moved, and the perfection of Ultra Instinct carried him through combinations that blurred the line between technique and art. Each strike was placed with impossible precision, each dodge anticipated before the attack it avoided had even begun. He existed purely in the moment, thought eliminated, only action remaining. Action so refined and perfect that reality itself seemed to accommodate it. And for a few seconds, it actually worked. His blows connected, and while they didn't seem to hurt Calvex in any conventional sense, they at least affected it, forced adjustments in its partially present form. The entity's flickering became more pronounced, as though Ultra Instinct's perfect timing was somehow catching it in moments of transition when it was slightly more vulnerable than usual. But then Calvex adapted. It began to rewrite the concept of dodge in localized areas around itself, creating pockets of space where evasion became impossible not because you lacked the speed but because the idea itself ceased to exist. Goku felt the technique breaking down as the fundamental assumptions it operated under were altered. Ultra Instinct relied on the body moving without thought, on pure reaction that happened faster than consciousness could interfere. But when the space around you eliminated the possibility of evasion, when moving out of the way became a contradiction in terms, what did perfect reaction accomplish? He felt it slipping away from him, like trying to maintain a transformation while someone rewrote the rules that made transformation possible. The silver energy flickered, became unstable, and suddenly he was falling out of Ultra Instinct entirely, not through exhaustion but through having the technique rendered irrelevant by an enemy that could edit the foundational concepts it relied upon. Calvex took advantage of the opening, moving with speed that suggested it had been holding back before, and its hand touched Goku again. This time the contact was more deliberate, more sustained, and the effect was correspondingly worse. He felt his key signature wavering, becoming uncertain, as though the universe briefly questioned whether he should have energy at all. His recent memory of the battle started fragmenting, not lost entirely, but becoming fuzzy and uncertain, like trying to remember a dream upon waking. For 3 seconds, subjective eternity compressed into heartbeats, Goku forgot he was fighting. Forgot where he was, why he was there, what purpose had brought him to this place. He was just existing, confused and uncertain, while Calvex's presence pressed against the edges of his awareness and rewrote the context that gave his actions meaning. Then Vegeta was there, blasting Calvex with enough force to break the contact even though the energy attack itself was ineffective. Goku stumbled backward, memory snapping back into place with jarring suddenness, and realized he was bleeding from wounds that appeared and disappeared as reality decided whether they had occurred. Kakarot. Vegeta's voice was sharp with something that might have been fear if such emotion were permissible in the prince's emotional vocabulary. Stay focused. Whatever it's doing to you, I know, Goku gasped, trying to steady himself even as his key signature continued fluctuating unstably. It made me forget. Just for a moment, but I forgot why I was here, what I was doing. If you hadn't broken contact. He didn't finish the sentence because they both understood the implication. If the contact had been maintained longer, if Calvex had been given more time to rewrite his presence in reality, he might have forgotten progressively more. His purpose, his identity, eventually his existence itself, all of it subject to being edited by an entity that could cause the universe to question whether things should be real. Around them, the others were still fighting with the kind of desperate determination that came from having no alternative. But Goku could see the exhaustion setting in, the growing awareness that they were outmatched in fundamental ways that no amount of effort could overcome. This wasn't like fighting a stronger enemy where you could train and improve and eventually close the gap. This was fighting someone who operated by different rules entirely, who existed in a state that made conventional combat meaningless. And in the depths of his consciousness, that presence was pulsing more insistently now. The forbidden door stood open, light spilling through from the space beyond, and the offer it represented was becoming harder to ignore with each passing moment. He could feel divine severance waiting, patient and inevitable, ready to flood through him the moment he stopped resisting and accepted what it could make him become. There has to be something, he said aloud, though whether he was speaking to Vegeta or himself wasn't clear. Some weakness, some way to fight this. We can't accept that it's impossible. But even as he formed the words, he felt the hollowness of them. Because maybe it was impossible. Maybe some battles couldn't be won through determination and heart, and refusing to give up. Maybe some enemies were simply beyond what mortals could overcome while remaining mortal. Calvex's form pulsed with what might have been sympathy. "You're considering something," it observed, and its multidirectional voice carried uncomfortable perception. "Some desperate measure, some transformation or technique you've been avoiding. I can sense it. The potential for change hovering around you like possibility waiting to manifest. But let me save you the internal struggle. Even if you achieve whatever power you're considering, even if you transcend your current limits, I will adapt. I have existed in the void for eons. I have learned patience and flexibility that your mortal desperation cannot match." The assessment was probably accurate, which made it all the more terrifying. Even if he reached for divine severance, even if he accepted the cost and became something that could fight Calvex on equal footing, there was no guarantee of victory. Just the certainty of losing himself in the process. Becoming something that couldn't remember why winning mattered in the first place. He looked at the others. At Vegeta's fierce determination, at Gohan's analytical focus, at Piccolo's calm assessment even in desperate circumstances, at Krillin and 18 hovering protectively near each other despite knowing they were outclassed. These people, these connections, they were what he'd be sacrificing if he opened that door fully. Would their survival justify forgetting them? Would preserving the universe justify becoming something that couldn't comprehend why the universe mattered? "We need Beerus," Goku said abruptly, the realization crystallizing with sudden clarity. "This is exactly the kind of threat a god of destruction should handle. If we can keep Calvex occupied long enough for Whis to bring him." "Already here," a familiar voice said, and suddenly the god of destruction was present, his arrival so abrupt it suggested he'd been observing from a distance before deciding to intervene. But the relief Goku felt at his arrival died immediately when he saw Beerus's expression, grim in a way that spoke of battles already fought and lost. "You've faced it already," Vegeta said, reading the same signs Goku had noticed. "You tried to stop it and failed." Beerus nodded slowly, his usual arrogance completely absent. "Calvex isn't just powerful. It's operating according to principles that make conventional combat meaningless. My destruction energy, which should unmake anything it touches, simply doesn't register for something that exists partially outside our dimension. I tried, Goku. I threw everything I had at it, and it just absorbed it. Caused the universe to forget I'd attacked at all." The admission from someone who rarely acknowledged limitations felt like pronouncement of doom. If even a god of destruction couldn't affect Calvex, what chance did they have? Goku felt that presence stirring more insistently, felt the forbidden door opening wider, felt divine severance reaching through the gap with promises of power that transcended normal limits. And for the first time, he genuinely wondered if he'd have the strength to refuse it when the moment of true desperation finally arrived. Because that moment was approaching fast, and he could feel himself running out of reasons to say no.